Okay, so continuing on. Okay, so continuing on with the restoration, we're looking at playwrights now, and William Davenant and Thomas Killigrew. We've talked about them already. So we're looking first at Roger Boyle then, and Roger Boyle, he was one of the first writers of heroic tragedy. Now, heroic tragedy really based a lot on Milton and Shakespeare and earlier writers. And it's called heroic tragedy because it follows the heroic couplet, which is iambic pentameter, couplets rhymed AABB, so on and so forth. And obviously about a heroic character who usually dies at this point in time. The concept of tragedy is that man must die, so fail due to their tragic flaw, so on and so forth. So that's kind of what heroic tragedy is about. And Boyle was one of sort of the first writers of that. Helped it reach its popularity at this time. But then we look at Dryden is next on the list, and he was another writer of heroic tragedy initially, and that style began to decline fairly soon. It was replaced by tragedy in blank verse following neoclassical rules, and John Dryden was really good at that. And one of his works is All for Love in 1677, and that was sort of helped to launch him, and he's actually one of the major writers of this era. And he sort of contributed to another style known as comedy of manners, and it's usually pokes fun at the lead characters are rich people who are creating all sorts of machinations to get things that they want, either a beautiful woman or something along that line, with servants and so on and so forth. It really pokes fun at the mannerisms of rich people at that point in time. So it's called Comedy of Manners, and he sort of started the formation of that, but other writers will take it and run with it and make it one of the most popular forms of this era, and what this era has become known for. Next person is George Etheridge, and he started creating the fully developed comedy of manners, and it sets the pattern for later writers. And he draws the characters from, like I said, from upper classes. There's seduction, there's arranged marriages, there's witty repartee and the latest fashion, and all the kind of things you would expect to see out of a bunch of rich people on stage, just talking about what they do every day, which is kind of nothing because it's all family money. They don't actually work. So it's a lot of backbiting and gossiping and so on and so forth, and trying to get something that they feel they can't have. Like I said, usually a woman for a man. And Etheridge's, some of Etheridge's better known ones were Man of Mode and She Would If She Could. That's a pretty good one. Next one we have is Ms. Aphra Bean. It's kind of a strange one because that's a female character, a female playwright, and she was a very successful writer of what were known as intrigue comedies. So comedies that weren't necessarily comedy of manners, but more had some substance to them and made you think. And the real important thing about her, to be honest, is the fact that she was the first woman to make her living as a playwright. Now, in a time when women actually were barely even on stage, I mean, they were, but they were not looked upon as serious artists in this regard. And she actually made a living as a playwright. William Wycherley is our next one, and he followed Etheridge's style, and his plays actually, the moral tone of his plays offended many of the critics, which is one of the reasons that you see this kind of a push toward new writing and all of these pamphlets about how amoral the stage is. And Wycherley's works really are part of them. A lot of men deceiving women in order to sleep with them. Love in a Wood is one of his. The Country Wife is another one of his. Next person is Thomas Shadwell. And he was a very famous writer of humorous comedies, like Ben Jonson. Remember we talked about with the four humors in the body, the black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. He followed that sort of style, Ben Jonson style, and he was a pretty popular writer of those. We get to Thomas Otway, and he sort of took elements of neoclassicism and Shakespeare, and was a very serious playwright. I don't know about call it tragedy, but he was a serious playwright, and he wrote a couple of really well-known ones, which were The Orphan and Venice Preserved. You'll see those in pretty much any compilation of Restoration drama. Next person we have is Edward Ravenscroft, and he was a writer of farce. So back to my pub ale. After him, we have William Congreve, probably one of the best-known writers of this era, and his Comedy of Manners, same as the others, reaches its peak with his work. And honestly, he is really well known. One of his works is considered the best of all English comedies, and that is Way of the World, which is what you're going to be reading in class. Now we start looking at a couple of writers that, after the short, the pamphlet that we discussed earlier, is the Short View of the Immorality and Profaneness of the English Stage by Jeremy Collier. These writers start making a change, right? And our first one is George Farquhar. Now, he was able to maintain a lot of William Congreve's wit, but he ended his plays in sort of in more of a morally correct manner. So the man would be punished if he was found that he was trying to deceive a woman, and so on and so forth. He wrote The Beaux' Stratagem. He wrote several plays, but his last one was The Beaux' Stratagem, Beaux'. And he actually was a very accomplished actor as well, until I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 1700, maybe 1703. He actually was handed the wrong prop and put a few inches of a sword into a fellow actor accidentally, and was so shaken by it he never went back on the stage again. Guy didn't die, by the way. He lived. Sir Richard Steele is our next one. He was also a writer, a critic type thing. He wrote like the Daily Mirror and things like that. So he wrote a lot of commentary of the time. And he tended to put some sort of sentimentality and had protagonists drawn from middle class as opposed to always the rich. So his works were interesting, and a lot of them were comedic works, and he also influenced tragedy. Now, we talked about the Licensing Act of 1737, and it really did affect drama because it had to now all go through a censor critic to make sure everything was acceptable. So a lot of your domestic tragedy declined, leaving pretty much just comedies left to do. A guy by the name of George Coleman the Elder, which you don't see on your list, started sort of approaching that spirit of the Restoration comedy in his plays, but the two most well-known writers of this period are Oliver Goldsmith, a play called She Stoops to Conquer. And this is a play that sort of brought about the term laughing comedy. I assumed all comedies were laughing comedies, but nonetheless. The next one is Richard Brinsley Sheridan, probably of the two, the more well-known and probably the better of the two, actually. He wrote similar to Congreve's style, but he always let virtue win out. He is best known for The Rivals and School for Scandal. Probably even heard that title. We're going to go on to theater architecture here. Looking at Lincoln's Inn Fields now, this was built by Davenant in 1662, and it was basically remodeling a tennis court. So what we're looking at there is a roughly 30-foot wide by 75-foot deep theater, and it worked fairly well for a lot of his stuff. But he found that it was not very functional for his operas. So in 1671, he built a new theater called the Dorset Garden Theater. Now this was, I think, about 57 feet by about 140 feet, and this he started doing a rake stage, grooves in the stage to move set pieces on and off, trap doors, flying equipment. This is major machinery, like we were talking about with Italianate scenery back in the Renaissance. So this was sort of a blueprint for what all theaters of the Restoration were going to become, was this style. It wasn't used too much after about 1682, and it was torn down by 1709. But the reason it's important in our theater architecture is because it sort of sets the layout for all other theaters. All right? The Covent Garden Theater was built by John Rich, former manager of the Lincoln's Inn Field and the son of Christopher, which we've talked about them already. You should have that in your notes and know what I'm talking about there. Theater opened in 1732. Actually, with Congreve's The Way of the World, it opened up with. And the interesting thing is here is that I think there's some motive there because, frankly, Christopher Rich, his dad, had been a manager of the Drury Lane and was fired. So I kind of, you kind of think that perhaps there's a little bit of vindictiveness in the opening of the Covent Garden Theatre to compete with the Drury Lane. It burns down in 1808, rebuilt in 1809. It could hold the same amount the Drury Lane can hold at this time, which is about 2,000 people. So looking at the Drury Lane, the golden age of this theater was theoretically 1710 to 1733, and it was managed by three of the actors, and that was Colley Cibber, Robert Wilkes, and Thomas Doggett. And that was sort of the heyday of that theater. And then another person sort of wrested control of it, a guy named Charles Fleetwood. And he pulled away control of it around 1733 and started going downhill. It wasn't until another actor by the name of David Garrick, one of the most important men of this era, comes and takes over management in 1747, and he turns it into one of the foremost theaters of this era. And he makes it one of the most important theaters, and by the time he turns it over in 1777 to Thomas Sheridan, it is one of the more popular theaters in London. It was kind of falling apart by 1791, and it was demolished and then rebuilt in 1794 by Henry Holland was the architect. Not that you need to know that. There's just more information you don't ever need to know in your life. And he upped the capacity of the seating to about 3,600. And he claims at that point in time that now the theater is fireproof. And it burned down in 1809, and another one is built on its site in 1812, still stands today. And I've been there, and it's still standing and looks great. So basically what you're looking at for a theater description of theaters at this time is the auditorium is divided into pit, boxes, and galleries, just like we were kind of seeing back in the Renaissance. The pit's raked to improve sight lines. And there were backless benches with rows on, so if you're sitting in the pit area, the groundling area, that area is raked up, and there's benches on there for you to see. And there's about 2 or 3 rows of galleries, depending on the size of the building, and the bottom's divided into boxes. Many of the theaters were fairly small overall in the very beginning. Initially, the Drury Lane seated like 650, so it wasn't exceedingly large. And I think the dimensions from the proscenium arch to the back of the house was only like 36 feet. So you're talking pretty small theaters in general. The proscenium arch had 2 doors on either side. That'll come down to 1 in a little while. And it was... it had an extension on the front of the proscenium arch, and that will slowly kind of pull back. So it was almost like a thrust theater from the proscenium arch out into the pit, and that pulls down a little bit later. The stage was also raked from the front to the back, with grooves set in the floors for wings and shutters and stuff like that, trapdoor machinery. All this basically came from the concept that Davenant had about what he needed for his operas. And it kind of ended up being sort of standard for all theaters. The interesting thing also that you find is as they start utilizing scenery where they're doing perspective painting, very much like we did in the Renaissance era. If you think about it for a second, if you go up the rake stage toward that sort of focal point at the back there with your wings coming on in staggered and painted in perspective, if you, as an actor, ever walk all the way up there, you're going to look massive up against the back stuff on the wall. So what they actually did at that point in time is any kind of background people that were walking around in the upper area here, what we would call upstage, any kind of those background people there, they quite often would use midgets so that they would actually be proportionally correct to those who are on the forestage area there. So it's sort of interesting ways to deal with these problems at hand. So Looking now at scenic practices, most scenic practices from about 1660 to roughly 1749 were very similar to those of the Renaissance. Stock set pieces, they were kept for many years, and they had an act drop. That was different, where once the main curtain opened, which had curtains to begin with, most of the Renaissance series didn't have those, but in the proscenium arches that they were using, they had curtains. So once the main curtain opened, it stayed open the rest of the show. All scene changes were done, inside of the audience. But they would have occasionally, they would act drop, so it would be another curtain that would drop between acts. By 1735, we start to see some scene painting become sort of regular, as far as they actually hired people as regular staff members to be their scene painters. Spectacle is starting to become a little more important. Lighting begins to start making its headway onto the stage. Now, granted, at this time, they're still lighting definitely the audience area with chandeliers, and they have candle lighting on the stage as well. But all of a sudden, you start having someone like a man by the name of de Loutherbourg, Philippe Jacques de Loutherbourg, as a designer. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. And he starts doing interesting things, like he would use colored silks in the curtain, the windows, so that the lighting that would come in would be colored now and give an effect. Gauze to give sort of a breakup look. By 1744, they start having candlelight on sort of side vertical ladders that were on the sides of the stage. So what we call light trees today, that's what they had. And they had these little scene blinds. So if you imagine you've got a candle right here, and you have a piece of wood or something to that effect up here on a string, when it's time to dim this light, you lower that down. It puts a block in front of the candle so the light doesn't go out. So that's how they had primitive dimming. In 1749, John Rich imported Jean-Nicole Servandoni as a famous scene painter, and he began a trend that would change English scenic practices as far as scene painting is concerned. Now, I said we talk about Philippe Jacques de Loutherbourg, and in 1771, David Garrick hired him to paint scenery, and he continued there until 1781. So this ended up launching him as the most important designer of the 18th century. And he would do strange things. He would like try to popularize real locations on stage instead of sort of, oh, that's a field, or it's he would set it to the point where, oh my God, I've been to that field and I've seen it. He had ground row pieces to sort of break up the stage area, which was also kind of unheard of, and gives a lot more depth and reality. He used sound effects, hail, rain, all that kind of stuff, to give a greater illusion of reality to it. And like we said, we talked about with the silks and stuff on the windows to give a better lighting effects. He installed overhead battens to hang lighting from. And he was one of the first designers to attempt to achieve an overall unity of design, lighting and scenery and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of unheard of until right now. So it wouldn't be until the 19th century that people will match that sort of a unity in design, and realism is even seriously considered whatsoever on stage. In 1785, we had the Argand, or patent lamp, which was invented. This was used for stage lighting. It was an oil lamp, with a glass chimney. So now this kind of thing can be placed in the footlight area. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the footlight area. It's down at the very end of the downstage area. If you look at old cartoons or sometimes even old movies where they have those little scallop shells in the front of the stage, that's to cover the footlights, which would put light up to your face. Kind of had some garish shadows to it, but it was the best way they could light faces of the actors from that angle. And the patent lamp was an oil lamp, so now it's no longer a candle, which is cool. But the glass chimneys that covered it, they figured out, well, if we color those glass chimneys, now we can effectively like gel lights and have effects. So that was a real good step forward in lighting technology, the Argand or patent lamp in 1785. All right, looking at costumes here, we really don't have much of a change from the Renaissance insofar as they're wearing contemporary clothing. and occasionally a tragic character as Hamlet would be black, something to that effect. But overall, they weren't historically exact. Costumes were what most people had. Sometimes they were gifts from noble patrons. There was a lot of those. It was not unheard of to see the Duchess of York's last year's dress be walking down the street because an actress had been given it. So a lot of your actresses were in dresses that nobility would give them because they're their mistress. So they would take their wife's hand-me-downs and give them to their mistresses. And these were important pieces, articles of clothing. These were very important costumes. Women would fight over these. There's a report actually of a director who is, there's two actresses in this place called, oddly enough, The Rival Queens. And one of them was his mistress. So he gave her the prize dress, and the other one was really pissed off about it. So in a scene where she's supposed to stab her with a knife, she really stabbed her, stuck it in about an inch or so into her ribs, because she was pissed off that she got the dress and not her. So fun stuff, and probably would make theater far more lively. But that's kind of what the costumes are looking at. There is a lot of contemporary clothing, but sometimes you see just royal garb up there. Well, it's because it was handed down from either a noble patron or handed down from a noble to his mistress or something along that line. So that's what our costumes are. In the next section, we will go over actors, and I believe we have a couple other things, and theater companies, acting in general, known actors and actresses, dramatic genres, and audiences.